So hi everyone. Thanks so much for coming out on a rainy, freezing night. It's freezing for LA. So appreciate it. Yeah, we have a lot to unpack tonight. This is a film that we are all so proud of and takes on some incredibly hot button issues that we're going to try to delve into a little bit. Professor Sean Harper was supposed to moderate this discussion, but he has just fallen ill. So we're going to have a bit more of an informal conversation. But it's kind of a bummer because he actually is from Augusta. He's a Black American from Augusta and had some really interesting insights that he wanted to offer. But he is unfortunately not able to be here. So we'll just start. Crystal, I will start with you. At what point did you realize that your family had this long and complex history in the South? You grew up in the Bay Area, right?
Right.
So at what point did you realize this, and what compelled you to want to really dig into it?
Yeah. So growing up in San Francisco, because my grandmother ran away when she was 17, I missed that whole Southern history. And originally, I have to say that it wasn't about race. It was about my unruly grandmother who ran away. But as I started to dig, I realized that, wow, we were sitting on this racial structure that nobody cared to question. And when I asked my family members questions about how they felt towards Black people, this light bulb went off like, oh my God, holy shit. None of us really talked about this before. And so how do I address this? And how do I turn a personal story into something that speaks to a larger critical problem in not just this country, right? It's like around the world. It's like this anti-Blackness that I learned. This vocabulary wasn't even in my head when I started this, and so it really took a lot of research. And as you all know, Black Lives Matter happened a couple of years ago, and it shifted my story from a personal woman story to a very large race relation story. And then anti-Asian hate happened, and then that spun it into another whole other thing. So how does Black lives meet anti-Asian hate? I think that was where I had to bring this whole film together.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting, Crystal, when you talked to your mom, or your mom told you that you could marry anyone, but she didn't want you to marry someone.
How many people actually had their parents tell them that? Any Asians? Look how many people. See, does that make you feel weird? It's such a reality.
Let's explain here. I'm the executive producer of this film. Ryan is a friend of ours, but Ryan is mixed race. He's Chinese and Black. He's lived in that middle space for his whole life. And so I thought it would be interesting to bring him up here for this conversation.
Asked him today.
Yeah, we just asked him today. But he saw the film in Vancouver. He was invited up to Vancouver Film Festival over the weekend. He saw the film. He found it very profound because these are topics that he's thought about his whole life. Yeah. Growing up in this.
But Crystal, when you grew up with your mom saying this to you, and you probably didn't even question it, right? As a young girl growing up, and then when you started to sort of dig into this, I imagine it started to make sense.
And it started to feel uncomfortable and ugly. Like, why was this attitude perpetuating? Not just with Chinese, right? A lot of Asian cultures have the same narrative, and so it's like we're tuned in to not question these structures. And when you start questioning, it's like, okay, where do we go from? How do we take this?
How do you unpack that? Right? How do you move forward?
So Daniel, you are one of the executive producers, and you have had a relationship with Crystal. What compelled you?
Crystal is very good friends with my sister, my oldest sister in Hong Kong, and then we knew each other in Hong Kong as well from being.
I know some of you are wanting to live vicariously through that notion. But what compelled you, Daniel, to want to come on as an executive producer?
Well, first of all, when she brought the film to me and told me about it, the first few minutes I was watching the film, like, whoa, Chinese people with Southern accents. This is interesting, right? And then I delved into it, and I was right in the middle of me and Daniel Day Kim working on the anti-Asian hate stuff going on and unpacking what all that meant. And I realized that there was serious tensions between the Asian and Black communities. And I saw this film and I go, whoa, what a great way to get this conversation started, because in order for us to address these issues, we need to unpack a lot. We need to go back generations, right? And why these things are either conscious or subconscious in people's mind. Whether it's these structures or what it's your family's been telling you or whatever that you've been growing up with, we need to unpack that. And I even had to reflect on myself, because I remember during the anti-Asian hate stuff, I was like, the model minority myth. Up until that point, like my parents pushed it on me that was a good thing, to be white adjacent, to be the model minority was a good thing. And I didn't understand later that was really a construct of this whole system of structuring how race should be in this country, and that we need to get away from that. And so I thought the film was a perfect place to start those conversations.
And also because we both lived in Hong Kong for so long, we didn't really see that race.
Yeah, that was another interesting thing, is because when I came back to America after being away for 20 years, I forgot all about race and how I lived through that up into my teenage years. But then you go back to Hong Kong, where you are in a community where everyone's the same.
Homogenous environment.
Yeah, homogenous environment. You don't have to think about it. And then coming back, like, whoa, okay, that muscle got weak in my head, and now I got to like strengthen that muscle again and learn how to deal with it. Yeah.
See, it's interesting. My experience was pretty different, because my grandparents came to America in the late 40s. They had gotten educated in the U.S. My grandfather went to NYU for undergrad and then got his MBA from University of Colorado. But when they moved to the United States in the late 1940s, he couldn't get a job working in finance because he was Chinese. And so he and my grandmother, they scraped up enough money to eventually open a Chinese restaurant, even though neither of them knew how to cook, but it was one of the pathways that so many migrants and immigrants have taken to achieve some semblance of the American dream. And I mentioned them in a social media post once, and I got a message from someone who said, I just want to thank you, because my grandparents, who are black, I'm black, they weren't allowed to dine in restaurants in the 1950s, but your grandparents were the only people who allowed them to eat in the restaurant. And my aunt, who went to the same high school I went to in a very non-diverse community, she and Dusty Baker grew up together, who just won the World Series. And even though they were both popular kids, they weren't allowed to do certain things because she was Chinese and he was black. But despite that, I mean, that was my own family experience. I remember as a kid hearing that term, hukgway. I heard it in church even. And so when I saw your film, when Daniel asked me to watch it, it made me so uncomfortable, because it was addressing those unspoken things that you would hear about, and you always kind of wondered, like, where did that term come from? But you know it's a derogatory term. And I think we need to have those uncomfortable moments and conversations. And that's the reason why I feel so strongly about this film, because it does make everyone feel uncomfortable, but it just unpacks and really digs into the roots of racism in this country, particularly between Asian blacks. Daniel,
but yeah, that's precisely the point. We need to face that discomfort for a little bit to get past that and move forward, I think. And I think that's probably why this film is so important to me, at least, is that it approaches that issue. Crystal bravely faces all the good and ugly parts of her family and unpacks this issue of race, and then presents an idea how to move forward.
I want to hear what Ryan has to say, embodying both sides and being on the other side in both sides. Yeah. You know, after you watch this film, were there some things that resonated with you or touched a chord where you knew what that felt like?
I mean, after watching it in Vancouver and talking to you after the film, I was like, usually one side deals with it and then the other side deals with it, and they don't talk to each other about it, right? And this film hit home for me too, because my black family is from Jacksonville, Florida, which is like a hop, skip, and jump away from Augusta. And just seeing like my black family in this film, basically, and the black people, and then interacting with Chinese people was something that I've never seen, right? In my experience growing up in LA, especially after the riots, there was an interaction between black and Asian, and specifically for me, I'm Chinese, there wasn't that interaction. So even though I grew up with my Chinese side of the family, my parents are still together, but I grew up with my Chinese side of the family because they all live here. I was Chinese inside of the house. But then when I'd step outside, I wasn't Chinese.
You grew up in like the Monterey
I grew up in San Gabriel Valley. Shout out to San Gabriel Valley.
Yep.
Yeah, baby.
Did you experience racism in the Chinese community because you present
blatantly
as black?
Blatant racism from my own community, which is ironic and funny because I don't have the privilege of being like, I hate all Chinese people because I am Chinese. You know, like I'm not gonna say I hate my people even though they're being racist to me, which kind of puts a lot of things into perspective because it's not the people, it's the ideology that has been conditioned into our minds through an oppressive system that we grow up in America, right? We're not taught our history. We're not taught African American history. I didn't learn African American history in my neighborhood. It was, I'm not gonna say the name. It's one of the cities in San Gabriel Valley, though. You know,
you didn't learn Black history at all?
No, I mean, I had very traumatic experiences in that school. I had a classmate show up in blackface and get escorted off campus. The first time I was called N-word, the N-word was in 3rd grade by...
Was it a mostly white school?
It was like 70-40. 70% white, or 70-30, wow.
Not living up
that wasn't your Asian
Chinese
right?
side. 70-30, 70 white, 30%, 30% Asian, 0.1% black, which was me. And it was a very isolating experience. And I remember a teacher, she was white, told me, Ryan, Black History Month is over, okay? Pick somebody else to study, because you can't study any more black people. But the reason I'm here is because I make content that talks about that, and I can look back at it and use humor to sort of deal with that pain and that strife, and also understand that it's not these people that I hate. I don't have hate or anger towards people. I have a hope that the system will change, and that can only happen if we have dialogues like this, if we have documentaries like this where people actually talk to one another and understand that they're not so different than they think they are.
And Crystal, I'm curious about how your family has reacted. I mean, I really was so moved by how candid and open they were, even in this environment. But what has their reaction been to this film?
Mostly, I would say positive, but I have some things that you don't see. You know, what you see is the finished product. But 2 days before we finished our lock picture, my Aunt Barbara, the one who married a black man, said she didn't want to be in the film. So I had all these footage of her talking about her experience, and then I had to cut it all out. And I don't know what triggered her to pull back. There was maybe a fear of how she was going to be judged. So I think that was a big part of it. And so sometimes it's the silent spaces that speak louder, right? There were lots of parts where there were, like, you don't remember when we were talking about the bus scene and you told me that you thought it was too sensitive, the Chinese guy who said something derogatory. And I don't know if you felt that, but a lot of people have asked since we've muted that down, say, what did he really say? What was it? How was it that bad? So I also wanted to talk about that because how far do we take it to open up these honest and raw truths about how we feel about each other, or how much do we kind of pull back and just use a respectful tone to address it, but that doesn't really get to the heart of it. You know, it's like, how are we going to talk about these tensions with that? So, but back to my family is there were a few that kind of pulled back, and I wasn't allowed to use a lot of the footage. So what you saw was these grand aunties who probably were very happy to be asked about their lives, because I don't know if you've noticed that I really had a slat with the women, because I feel like women are historically silenced and we don't ask them stories. They're not preserved in history books. Not only do we not know about the Chinese in the South, but we, more importantly, don't hear the nuanced stories from women, which reveals a deeper history in my perspective.
And so, even for those relatives who asked not to be part of it, now that they've seen it, how have they reacted?
Yeah, in positive ways. So I'm reinforced that there is hope, that we can bring this out. My mom, who still says that term, and I have to say it's not Hukwe, and we have to consistently talk about it and just normalize these conversations. That's what I think.
Daniel, was there a particular aspect of this film that really resonated with you, that you felt like, okay, this is something that people need to be aware of, or any kind of context that you thought surprised you?
I think it was mostly just the raw honesty that Crystal approached it all with, and that she was fearless in doing that. Because I think a lot of people would be, especially Asians, are embarrassed to show their bad side, right, or the bad side of the family, and that Crystal wasn't in this situation. And I thought, okay, let's use this as a departure point to really bring up the more important conversation that we need to talk about race in this country. And so it was very brave, and I really respect that. And I was very proud of her for doing it and approaching it that way. Because again, as she said, this originally wasn't a documentary about race. It was about her grandma who had ran away from the family, and it really delved into this other whole situation that she unpacked very clearly. And it really made us look at the structures that we live in today and go, we have to question that. Like, I have to question my mom and dad, right? I really love them, I really respect them, but mono-minority, sorry, that's not cool, right? And now I gotta tell my daughter that's not cool. We gotta change it from the generations down. And so this movie really got me to really think about how I'm gonna raise my daughter now, right? And unpack those structures that were put in place many, many years ago. Because my parents came here in the 50s, right? In the 60s. And as new immigrants, you're even taught, don't be like them, be like them, and this is where the whole model minority thing came in, right? And so my mom saw that, and she was so proud to be successful in white spaces, right? And nothing to knock on her at all. I'm very proud of her, but at the same time, it's like you have to look at the bigger picture and realize that we are being pitted against each other, and the structures and systems want us to be pitted against each other.
How do you feel? You can't, as an immigrant, come here. Right, your intention is to come here to have a better life, and you can't not recognize these structures that are in place.
Right,
when you come
but also you can't blame them either, because they're coming here for a better life, and they're trying
exactly.
to. Yeah,
that's what I was going to say. The older generation, we did this for you. We sacrificed our freedom for you, and how do we speak to that and address racism at the same time?
Yeah, and I think that for most of us, when our families first came to this country, they didn't take the time to understand or know the history, right? And it's hard to even find. I mean, Ryan, you were talking about how you didn't even have Black history, African American history in.
Did your dad ever tell you things?
I learned all the Black history from my dad. I showed up to school and said, Teacher, I don't think Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. I think it was, Frederick Douglass and the slaves that fought in the war, and they would just tell me to be quiet,
This is really shocking to hear this, because I'm way older than you, 20-something years older than you, and I got Black history in a white community in Northern California, basic stuff, right? And then I went to private school, and I took it for granted that I learned Asian American history too. Wow. And I realized a lot of my friends did not learn anything about Asian American history.
I think it's interesting because I feel like I got a bit of Black history.
Yeah, what? Yeah. Just like Slave 101.
Yes, but it was still a bit. I mean, there was no Asian American history whatsoever.
Right.
I never learned about the contributions of a single.
It's just Asian the railroad story and the laundromat.
I didn't even get the railroad story.
You didn't even get that?
I didn't.
I'm surprised that a lot of people don't know about the railroad story.
I'm from Sacramento.
Yeah, and some people don't even know about Japanese internment, all that. Asian Americans don't know about it. It's like, what? What do you, how come you don't know that?
Yeah.
So I took all that for granted because I went to a school that was relatively progressive. So it's shocking to be here 20 years later.
And you didn't
learn any of that.
What about the Chinese history side then?
Chinese history, they built the railroad kind of.
Right.
Yeah.
So Ryan, we saw in this film that Crystal had Black relatives that she didn't even know about, and that their grandmother, while she loved them, didn't want them to play outside. Did you ever feel from your own family members those tensions?
I think I was.
And how did you navigate them?
Yeah, I think I was really lucky in the sense that my family made it a point right away to not abide by what society thought of us. And that's how I was raised, and that's why I carry myself. I say I'm 100% Black and 100% Chinese, because if you don't decide who you are, the system is going to decide for you. And so, no, I would always be in the Chinese community. I had the same experience that she had. I would be in the grocery store with either my mom or my grandma, and they would literally talk shit in Chinese to my grandma or my mom, not knowing that I was their child. And I could understand the shit they were talking to, which is so ironic and actually kind of funny, because it's like, oh, you thought, no, So yeah, there's a lot of experiences like that, but I am lucky in the fact that like my family never made me feel like I didn't belong. But the second I stepped foot outside, I was like, okay, this is a little different. But I always had that internal drum inside of me that knew who I was. And honestly, it wasn't until like 2 years ago, at the height of BLM and Stop Asian Hate, when they both sort of hit a crux, and almost seemed like they started to turn against each other, that I felt like I had to just talk about this publicly. Like I had never talked about being Chinese publicly.
When the attacks against Asians started to happen, I wonder, because you felt so so much of an outsider in your mostly Asian community, and so when attacks on Asians started to happen, what did you think about that? Did it surprise you to learn that this was starting to happen?
It was very surprising and very painful because, that's my family. When I see those Asian elders being attacked, I feel that same rage, and I want to do something about it. But for me, I'm not like, when I see a black person do that, I'm not like, we gotta go, take it out on the black community. You know what I mean? I'm like, no, we need to do something about why there is hate there in the first place. We're fighting ignorance. Yeah. We're not fighting a community, So when I started making the content that I make was at that point where I was like, okay, I want to do something about this. And I don't want to do it with hate. I want to do it with laughter and humor and, okay, can I do this? And at first, it was a cutting humor. It wasn't, it was a little hateful in the beginning. But I needed to get that out. And I remember the first post that I made was a post talking about how, as a Blasian, the first racist experiences that I experienced were from my own community, right? And sort of calling on the Asian community to understand, like, look, I'm Asian just like you, but there is anti-blackness, and it is rampant in our community, and we need to do something about it. And if you're not listening to me, and if you're gonna condemn me for saying it at this time, then maybe you're racist, and maybe you need to deal with that, because I'm an Asian just like you. And I expected no support. I expected people to say, like, shut up, you black trash, like, shut up, this is not your time to speak. But 95% support. And it went viral. And of course I still got a lot of Asians saying very racist things to me, but I did not expect that support. And I would never have expected 2 years ago to be here with my heroes talking about being Asian, you know what I mean? And talking about how prideful I am being both, and how we can bridge that divide, because there really isn't a divide. It's been conditioned into us.
Ryan, just tell everybody what your Instagram handle is, because...
By the way, Ryan's Mandarin is probably better than both of them. Their Mandarin, right? Ryan's Mandarin is very, very good. It's very good.
My handle is Ryan Alex H. Come through and laugh and be educated at the same time.
But your parents also have such a beautiful relationship. I mean, I've drawn so much inspiration from seeing your posts about your parents.
I love my
and how they raised you. But where did that foresight come from in your parents?
And also, I have a question. Is like I grew up with a few friends that were Blasian, but like I have a friend that was a very good friend from high school, is black and Korean, but he grew up in a black neighborhood because his father was black. What brought you to a Chinese neighborhood? Is this rarer that you see that?
Best schools in the San Gabriel Valley. Mm-hmm. Probably guess what city that is. But yeah, my parents, the foresight that they got, I mean, my dad grew up in the Jim Crow South. He brought himself out of poverty, so he experienced that tenfold, and then experienced being the only black person in Los Angeles, being like one of the top lawyers in the firms out here. And my mother is an immigrant from Taiwan, and she came to America to study at UPenn and didn't really know English very well, so she was sort of, very much an immigrant. And the way they met was, my mom was a news anchor for the Chinese news out here, but on the side she would translate and teach Chinese. And my dad was doing business in China and needed a teacher on a high caliber, and that's how they met. But I think the foresight too is just
How
like,
did it go over with their families when they started dating
Yeah,
and
just
eventually?
about to get
Okay, sorry. Okay.
No. I'm saying that it's like it took a lot of work. Both sides of the family disowned both my parents, and they didn't have them at their wedding. You know, it was who was at their wedding was like their friends in Los Angeles. You know, and it wasn't until my cute ass and my brother's cute ass were born that my Chinese family was like, oh, shit. They're cute, and they got our blood, you know, and so that created the bond. That created because my Chinese cousin, I grew up with my Chinese cousins. I grew up very Chinese, you know, and I feel like a lot of people are very confused when I'm like speaking Chinese and I do my old man accent, and they're like, how the fuck do you know how to speak like that? But that's how I was raised, you know, and I also was partly raised in a black community too, because my dad made it a point to not just teach me black history and sort of teach me out of a textbook and not leave me at the whim of looking at, like, you know, how we're portrayed in the media to decide what black was. I joined the Pasadena Running Roses in the north part of Pasadena that was all black, and that changed my perspective completely. Because when you're in the black community, you see black people for the humans they are, right? When you watch this documentary, you see black people for the humans that they are. And if you don't have black friends, if you're not in the black community, do not for a second think that you know black people, because you don't.
Not even the one token friend, right? That
No,
maybe you don't say, hey.
not the 0.1% at I don't want to say the city. It's at the school, because when I was growing up too, and I didn't have any black people around me at my elementary school, and this is what the system does to people who aren't black. They told me that I didn't act black enough. That I was wearing skateboard shoes, Osiris's. I don't know if you know Osiris's. I was wearing Osiris's to school, and they're like, you need to wear Jordans, and you need to wear baggy pants.
This is before
rap.
Pharrell, huh?
Yeah, it's before Pharrell, before Kanye. Before like being black was not just what they saw in rap videos.
When you say they, who do you mean?
The kids that I grew up with, which were mostly white and Chinese.
One thing I learned about, we talk about blackness in my process of research, is that even within the black community, the hierarchy of color, because of the enslaved history, it creates a very strong tension even between black, dark, the shades. And we, from the Asian community, not knowing that, it just opens up a whole nother history that we need to kind of really look into those nuanced spaces.
Yeah, absolutely.
Listening to Ryan talk, I've just suddenly realized, like, maybe the subconscious reason also why I was so interested in this film is that I grew up in a white suburban town called Orinda, right? And my next door neighbor, who I'd known since kindergarten, was black. And he was the only black person in the school. And there were a couple of Asian kids in the school, but we were tight. We were super tight. And we experienced prejudice and racism together, like being treated as others together. And I think that's why I grew up with an empathy for anybody who's been, marginalized or treated unfairly, And so I would defend him, he would defend me. It was this thing, we stuck together. I just suddenly realized that.
Yeah, so how do you feel about the anti-Asian hate crimes when a majority of the perpetrators, at least they frame, are black people, and how that kind of reinforces these tensions?
Well, that's the thing, is that it's not about the community, it's about certain individuals, right? And so there are white people doing it, there are Latino people doing it, there are black people doing it, there's all kinds of people doing it towards Asians because of the rhetoric or whatever that happened during, the Trump era or whatever you could say. And so that enabled people to just speak out, and in whatever tension they were holding or anger they're holding towards the Asian community, it came out in those moments, right? Because COVID was a perfect example to let that come out, right? And it was in certain individuals, it's not entire communities. So it was really painful for me to see a lot of people in our community go blaming the entire black community on stuff like that. It was very painful to see that, right? And vice versa, then to see black people go, see, Asians were never with us anyway, right? And it's like, for me, growing up with a really close black friend, like, it was really painful to see that. And we would talk. He's in Georgia now. He actually lives in Atlanta, and we text a lot. And then we talk about all this stuff together, because he's gone off and become really he went to Morehouse He lives in a very black community now, and so he's become more and more attuned to his community. Like I would say, when we grew up in the suburbs, we both were white adjacent, and we were more kind of like white than anything else. And then he's become more and more in tune with his culture, so we talk a lot about this stuff. And I talk about how this tension really pains me because we grew up without that. We grew up as two friends, individuals that saw no color there, right?
It's such an interesting point you're making, Daniel, because I think there have been, because Daniel and I have been fairly outspoken about Asian hate, there's a contingent of Asians who accuse us of not naming black assailants more because so many of the videos that are circulating feature a black assailant. But yet, I not too long ago, I went on Jada Pinka's Red Table Talk.
I was just going to ask you.
And she told me that when they promoted that they were going to take on anti-Asian hate, they were overwhelmed. They got more hate mail from their viewers because there's so much tension, or so many in the black community felt so much tension regarding their own experiences with Asians in their own community. And frankly, I had no idea the depth of those roots of tension.
So even when the grandmother was talking about her experience at the airport and saying, why are Asians so standoffish to us? That dug into like a little sensitive
Jada's
chord
mom talked about on the show, she was in the airport and there was an Asian woman and didn't even take the time to talk to her. And in that moment, and Professor Eric Michael Dyson kind of called her on it. Like, you're taking that moment to generalize the entire Asian community. In the same way, Asians should not take these moments, right, to generalize the black community. And I think that that's what we just so tend to do. And so, Crystal, I wonder, has anyone talked to you about why you wanted to bring these issues up, or has there been anyone who has said, like, why do you want to?
Oh my gosh!
Why do you want to bring up these
yes.
these deeply challenging issues?
Especially the older Asian community. I remember when I went to Georgia to do my work in progress, I presented it to give them respect. This is the community I'm talking about, and I wanted to hear what they thought in this little bits. And the mic went quickly to this older Chinese man who has been kind of prevalent in that community for a long time. He took the mic up, he goes, "You got this all wrong." And I went, "Yeah, okay." He says, "You should be focusing on the contributions of the Chinese into society." But that's how Chinese think, right? It's a collective feeling. And I didn't, I understand where he's coming from, but at the same time I said, this is not my story. I don't want to do that. Tons of people are doing that already. We're amplifying all the famous people and all the biggest professions, but these small stories are where, for me, the hidden histories come out, the intimate histories, because we don't talk about that sensitive thing about, like, oh my God, having sex with a black man? Who talks about that? Sorry. Just like, that's
these are taboo topics that need to be spoken about.
That's how Chinese think, right? Yeah.
And look, there's no denying that we are in the middle of a racial reckoning now. And so how do you hope that people will use this film to fuel more conversations and even maybe policy regarding these issues of race in America?
We need conversations like this, and I think it needs to be, even when we bring it home, we bring it to the intergenerational. I think there's a gap there we don't recognize, right? How do we talk to our parents and grandparents about these uncomfortable pasts? Let them talk about why they felt that way, what brought them to their thinking. And I also want to I hope we can get some feedback from our audience here about it, but I do think it comes with conversations. It starts with that. Is that oversimplifying?
I also love that you included your daughter in this, because she was just so, like, impervious to.
She was so
those
pure
issues.
when she said, "Love is tall, no color." Oh my God.
But what was that like for her when she learned about this darker history?
Yeah, well, she probably, like the younger generation here, knows much more than. Or we have this tainted lens because we have all these baggage from the older generation, but I think the younger generation, there's a hope there of seeing through that. It's like gender, it's the same thing. It's like we're breaking down these binary ways of thinking, and that's really, really important. And thus the name, Blurring, because I felt like the whole theme was approaching things from in between spaces. How do we complicate the narrative by having multiple focuses, by blending spaces, by recognizing our connective histories? It's not isolated. There's no such thing as just like the Asians in a space. These are encounters that have been fluid and multiple since day one, and that's the beautiful part of it.
So should we take some questions from the audience?
Does anybody have anything?
Anyone have any questions? I think there's some roving microphones.
There's one right in front.
If you raise your hand, we might be able to hear you if you just stand up and speak loudly. Oh, here's a mic.
Oh, hi, I'm Joyce, and I'm a sophomore student studying the Cinematic Art School right now. So thank you guys for being here today to share such an impressive story to us. And me personally, I grew up in Guangdong, and all my parents have taught me, not taught me, but talked with me with all those phrases such as "hakgui" and all this sayang stuff. But we never see those things such as intensified and serious about these words being used until we came here, and we know that we don't want people to call us in their ways for being offensive. And I want to know that during the production process, have you ever felt that this film will be criticized by the Chinese community by revealing this story to the community? And also, when this is lots of racist issue happening now in the society, how we view the impaction of this story bringing to such the color line of nowadays. Thank you.
Wow, thank you for that. And thank you for recognizing this is a transnational global issue, right? There's so many issues within China and Africa right now that there are lots of parallels to this. And colorism within, okay, I'm the first to say Chinese are probably one of the most racist races out there.
Against ourselves, even.
That's what I mean.
Northern and Southern, Beijing, Shanghai.
Because you're fit, right?
Yeah.
It's true.
My parents are from Shanghai, and they always say Guangzhou people are barbarians, right?
Best,
Cantonese is barbarian language, right?
I was dark. I'm peasant class. I'm I'm low on the bottom of the code.
Right. So we have to recognize that exists. It's the truth, and you can't hide that. That actually exists. So if people are angry about it, it's that they don't want to look in the mirror. And that's an important thing. We got to look in the mirror before we can move forward today, right? And if you're trying to put on a mask, it's a bunch of BS. You need to hide that. So I'm not afraid of people criticizing it, because the people criticizing it are racist. They are the ones unwilling to look in the mirror.
If anything, I think it's the bridge to recognizing the history of the Chinese people and the diaspora and how it turns into this bigger, story. Because what really frustrates me is we always seem to compartmentalize Asian history and Asian American. It's like they're two separate things. But you can't have one without the other, and it's all connected through history,
And it also does play into the debate that's raging in government and in school boards now about what history to teach in schools. I think that so much of American history is dark and ugly, and for so long, history has been told through a certain lens, and there's fear that if we expose that, it's going to make some people feel bad, or it's going to cause more tension, when in fact, by continuing to keep things under the surface and not address it or confront it, it's going to rear its ugly head again at some point soon, at some point in the future. And only when you address and confront the sins of the past, right, can you move forward and not repeat those same mistakes.
I mean, it's very simple in life. Like, you learn from your mistakes, so you have to look at your mistakes in order to move forward or be successful, right? If you're in business, or basic thing, learning how to ski, you only learn when you fall down, right? And then you get to become a better skier. I mean, sorry, that's a very privileged example, but you get better at it from falling down. You have to analyze why that happened and why things, and why that happened, why you can fix it to get better. And so it's the same thing. It's uncomfortable, but we have to look at those ugly truths in order to move forward or improve as a society, and not just sweep it under the carpet.
Typical Shanghainese example. Anybody else have a question? Right here. We have one more in the front, and then we'll go in the back.
Thank you for being here today. Something that the assembled crowd would, something that really might hit hope for them is the issue of affirmative action, which is one of the hot button issues within the Asian community and the Black community. There's talk of the Supreme Court reversing affirmative action policies. What does the assembled panel think is the best food forward? Sorry if that's too loaded a question.
I want to say that nobody likes to rock the boat, and that when you feel their place being threatened, that's where things change, right? And I think you can take that analogy to everything. And this is just one example of all the different things. It's not just about white supremacy. It's not about, Asians overtaking the academic world. It's about this fear of not having your space, losing power, losing, all of the things you've worked towards, and sharing that space, I think.
I attended this university many years ago, and I grew up in a suburb outside of Sacramento that was not diverse at all. In fact, our family was one of the few Asian families in the community, and I was so anxious and eager to get out of there because even though I was a popular kid, I always felt like I was on the periphery. I always felt like I didn't belong. I didn't feel like I was an American because I didn't look like what everyone else looked like. And so when I set foot on this campus, this whole world opened up to me of diversity. There were people who looked like me, but there were so many people who looked nothing like me, nor did they look like anybody that I went to school with. And that experience for me, those interactions, being in a classroom with so many people, not just who looked different, but who were from so many parts of the world, was probably the best education that I could have ever experienced. It taught me things that books couldn't teach me, those experiences. So without addressing that question head on, I can just say for me, when I came to this university, it opened up my eyes profoundly. And I think that I probably learned more from the people around me at this university because of their diverse backgrounds that I could have ever learned in a book.
Any other questions in the middle? I think the lady in the blue t-shirt.
Oh, there's a man that has that.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you guys so much for the movie. I really enjoyed it. I think it really related to my own experiences of trying to fit into white spaces and growing up like as a kid who didn't really always fit in. So I think while reflecting on the movie and trying to fit that into my own experiences, I think something that I realized is like while I'm here, I'm able to have these kind of conversations surrounding like anti-Asian hate and Black Lives Matter with like my peers who are fundamentally getting like similar information sources as myself. But I'm from Shanghai, and I went back to Shanghai over the summer, and I think something that was really that really shocked me was how different our like basis of information really was. Like they were not receiving the same like information, but rather kind of like plagued by propaganda and a lot of misinformation surrounding African Americans and Black people, especially with African immigrants in a lot of different parts of China. And I think I struggle to have these type of conversations not only with my grandparents, but even with my peers in China. So how do you think we can start these conversations with people who perhaps really disagree with us on like the information we receive and the opinions we have?
I think first of all, it's hard to blame them because in China it's a homogenous society, right? And now you're starting to get new immigrants, and therefore that's why you're having this misinformation or misinformed ideas of who those people are.
Not only is it homogenous, but it's totally censored.
Yes,
as well.
Yeah, sure. But there's a very interesting YouTube video. Try and look for it. It's about he's mixed race, Black and Chinese, that was given up by his parents and then raised by his grandparents in Shanghai. Yeah. And this kid only speaks Shanghainese, right? That's all. But he looks totally Black, and he grew up in Shanghai, and he talks about his experiences growing up there. It's a 15-minute video. But if people could like watch more of that and see some of those things and see the truth, they'll have more empathy for the situation and understand that we're all just people, you know. And when you watch that video, it's very interesting to see how he grew up in China and how much adversity he grew up against. When really he is Chinese. He grew up in Shanghai, and he's Shanghainese. He's not even Chinese. He's specifically Shanghainese. He only speaks Shanghainese, right? And then he's learning to speak English, and he can barely speak English. It's very interesting because he's not sure what he is. But if you watch that video, and more people in China watch things like that and realize that there are people that are Chinese but don't look like that. There's Ryan here, again, are Chinese but don't look like your typical Chinese. You'll see that we are actually all the same. So yeah, so I mean, it's hard to get beyond what's been forced upon them, or stereotypical ideas. It's very, very hard to go deeper. But people need to be pushed to go deeper.
It's hard in China, right? Because information it doesn't flow freely. But for ourselves, we can be proactive about learning about Black American history, about African American history. We can learn about our own history because, and sometimes it takes digging, because you could go through your entire educational life until you reach university without learning about so many aspects of Black history, Asian history. But when you take that time to explore what the Black American experience has been like in this country, you cannot help but better understand and empathize. And I think it gives you so much context into what we are experiencing today and why we need to continue to fight that diverse histories be taught in schools. We use the word empathy, and everyone's trying to be more empathetic. Well, empathy is actually taught. Empathy is learned. And by exposing our kids to multi-dimensional aspects of history, that's how they learn to become empathetic.
And to get the layers is that you have to go to personal spaces, though. I think you have to hear individual stories. There's a lot of creative content out there, right? People like Ryan creating them. You guys all have the power to create content where you go and interview somebody and you put these people together, these random, grandma, Chinese grandma, and then a Black kid from the neighborhood, and how do they converse? I mean, they're just like very simple ways, but I think that they open up a whole
even here at USC, look, this university is sitting on land that was once belonged to the Tongva people, right? But then this is a community that has been a mostly Black community for decades. Take the time to learn about this community that this university, is in the midst of, right? Learning about our own surroundings and digging deeper into the roots.
I lived in Shanghai. I studied at Fudan Dashi for 5 months, and and I didn't. It's not that I didn't experience racism there. It was just not the same flavor of racism. But the historical context is very important. In the content that I make. When I say that I lived in Shanghai, I say that I studied out there, a lot of people apply that same kind of racism that is here to China, and it's not the same at all. There was a literal system was created in America to specifically oppress Black people that doesn't exist in China, So me existing there, first of all, a lot of people have never seen a Black person before, so they're like touching my hair and handing me their babies to take pictures and stuff like that. But I felt, it's kind of crazy. I felt more at home there in the Chinese community in China than I did in my Chinese community in America. So I wouldn't underestimate sort of where these people's minds are in China, right? They might be easier to talk to than an American Chinese person who is born and raised in the system and is subject to the ideology that you just, if you don't opt out of, that's just how you think,
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, because that is true. Yeah, it's more, there isn't that system of oppression there. It's more curiosity, maybe ignorance, as opposed to being racism.
There was someone in the back who's been had his hand up for a while. The red.
all the way in the back.
All the way in the back in the red. All right, here comes the mic.
How you doing?
What's up?
For people wondering why I'm dressed like this, Ryan said it was going to be a film premiere, so I didn't want to come underdressed. But my name is Lawrence. I'm a friend of Ryan's. Ryan invited me to come over, and I have to say I really loved the film. I'm half white, half Chinese, but I grew up in Beijing. Anyways, specifically within and very much around the African neighborhoods in Beijing, which I feel like most people don't even know exist. In that respect, I was originally going to ask Ryan to elaborate more about his experience in China and how it was different here, but I found it very interesting how you guys mentioned that within the Chinese community, there is this divide. And I realize this myself too, you know, there's this thing where, you know, if you're from Beijing, oh, Shanghai, right? But anyways, do you feel that in the case of the divide between the Chinese community and the other communities here in America, or even the divide between the Chinese community and the black community here in America, do you feel that that plays a major part? And if it does, what are ways that we can look within to solve those issues first before we start to go out? Or do you feel like it's something that it should be simultaneously where we solve them both ways at the same time? So yeah, thank you.
I'm not sure how to solve those problems.
Well, ways we can start.
Yeah. Heavy, bro. Heavy. I think it's really great that you highlighted that point. I wish I knew how to solve those problems. I wish I knew. I mean, it's just like saying the same thing. How do you end racism, right? You start by the small conversations. You start by this dialogue. You start by what we're doing tonight, right? And you elaborate further and further, and then you start looking at each other as people, as humans. And also I want to point out that we're talking about Asian and black space. It's not like we're anti-white. I have a white wife. She has a white husband. I mean, we also care about the white community as well. It's not exclusive here, right? The point is that we all get along together, and then we move forward as a country or as a world culture, right? And that's really important. But really, I think what it starts is having real dialogue and breaking down those barriers of anger and hate. You know, that's the most important thing first.
I also want to say that the way you phrase that question, no offense, is reinforcing the binary that we're Asian American and Asian, but I think there are a lot of spaces that connect us that's why I want to emphasize transnational. That's like the key thing now, is that this bridging of, it's like we're not just one or the other, there are lots of mixed spaces there, and entanglement is the word I'm thinking of. We're all kind of like rooted together. If you look under the earth, these two trees are seemingly different species, but underneath the roots are kind of connected when they're growing, and you don't know that they're thriving off of each other underneath, but on the surface you think, oh, we're all separate and different.
Well, I think especially with the younger generation, like I think our generation, there was, you know, a lot of us tried to assimilate. I would say my older sisters, they tried to assimilate to American culture, whereas I think the younger generation, through food, through movies, through music, through all that stuff, they're much more connected to Asian Asian culture than ever before, because of the internet, because of social media, because of all kinds of stuff, right? Like, you know, my sisters kind of like didn't like eating Chinese food, you know what I mean? And now you don't see an Asian kid now that is not proud of eating Chinese food or having boba or whatever, you know, like all that stuff. And so I'm seeing that way more than ever before, and so that is a way to connect it all through, and this transnationalism that we're talking about here is more prevalent today than ever before, and I think that's a good starting point.
Yeah, because look at us here, we're all talking about Shanghai, Beijing, and you know.
But I do think that there's something unique about the Asian American experience.
For sure.
Versus
that is distinctly different.
Versus the Asian experience. And look, I mean, our country is a young one. You know, we're not even 300 years old, and you know, founded on this principle, right? That we are all created equal, and so it's still this experiment.
And we still don't know so much about each other. When I first moved to Hong Kong, I was like the ABC going over there, and they looked, I don't know if you had that same feeling. It's like, oh yeah, they're those Western ones. They don't really know their culture so well, so they get excused for saying something stupid.
I was asked, how come I knew how to use chopsticks? Don't you eat hamburgers all the time? And I was called guai zai, which is white boy. I was called white boy for many years, you know. And then even actually coming back here, making the decision to come back here and be in the entertainment business back here, a really good director friend of mine was really hurt by what he said was, I don't think that's a good idea. There's no space for you there, right? I don't think that's a good decision, right? And I was really hurt by that because he thinks that America is not for people like us, right? And I think it is. You know, I think America is a place for everybody. You know.
I think we. Yeah, let's do two. Let's do two more. Crystal, you pick.
Is that a dog over there? It's a dog, right?
Maybe a couple more. Okay, Crystal, you pick.
The lady in the. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for such an empowered conversation. So I'm the chief producer at Chinese National Television, CCTV, as we all know. And I'm also here leading a healthy fashion movement, try to empower women and young generations to be more confident and achieve their full potential. So far, our content has reached to over 9 million people from 14 countries. And you know that includes the media, the education, and investing. So my question for today is mainly to producers, because I know you are so encouraged to deliver these topics to more people. So I'm wondering, fellow, it's not Lisa, because you're our women's role model as a women warrior, and that's why I'm wondering, how would you bring this conversation wider to more people, and have more people globally to join it? And would you do it through maybe also launch a social media campaign, or would you also maybe design a health education, maybe not health, well, like educational programs that can be implemented in elementary school, or or even for people who are adults already, and.
That sounds like a good plan. You want to quit your job and work for us?
We're looking for impact producer.
Yeah, there's some good ideas there.
Wow, we can discuss about that and see how we can further.
I don't want to upset CCTV, so sorry. Maybe I should take that back.
I'm if it's okay, I'm going to punt this over to Crystal, because Crystal, there is a curriculum that you've developed around this film, right?
Yeah, we have a study guide, and our whole intention is to go into the education system. Elementary, well, not so far. We're focusing on high school and universities and maybe middle school, but there's a lot of work to do. But again, back to the question in the back too, is how do we make this a more global conversation? It's not a U.S. issue, right? We want to get into China. We want to get into different places. I don't know, but I do recognize that we need to do that. So thank you for that question.
Thank you so much. We'll discuss more about the job thing later. Thank you.
Well, and our hope is that you all will tell your friends, and they'll tell their friends.
Maybe
to check it out.
Quick question.
We're having this gentleman.
All right, and then one more in the vote.
Hi, I'm Benson, and I am a freshman here at USC, and I am an acting major at the School of Dramatic Arts. And I just want to say, first of all, my older sister, would freak out if she knew that I was this close to Daniel Wu right now. And I'm going to give her a call later and tell her, hey, I talked to Daniel Wu. And I'm going to smudge that in her face for the rest of my life. But anyways, I heard, Daniel, you talked about the entertainment industry. And I was born in China, Hangzhou. And I was brought to Canada, Vancouver to be specific, when I was 4 years old. And I've always been in the theater kind of industry back in Vancouver. But once in a while, I would go back to China and visit my family, my grandparents, relatives. But something I've realized was that, like, in China, theater and acting, this art form isn't really just respected. It's not really there. And when I came to USC, I thought that obviously USC is a very diverse community, but in School of Dramatic Arts, I've realized that people like me as Asians or just Chinese there were just not many at all. So I just want to ask, how are we? I've always wanted to try to bring this art form into China, into mainland China, and really share my passion for this art form with people like me. And how am I able to do that? And I know, Daniel, who you've been in this industry for many, many years. And
many years.
Yeah. Yes.
So,
yes, thanks for reminding me. This is kind of off topic, so I'm just going to answer real quickly. Is suck up everything you're going to learn here. bring it back there and introduce it. I've seen a lot of that happen. When I've been working in China and Hong Kong for 20-something years now. I've seen a lot of people go over to different countries in the world, learn a lot of stuff, come back and bring it back to China and re-innovate it there. And that's something you can do. So definitely do that.
Take one final question from the lady in the middle, in the brown. We'll be hanging around for a little while.
To go back real quick,
Yeah.
the best example is that Jack Ma, right? He learned a whole bunch of stuff from Silicon Valley and went back there and blew things up over there. So, I mean, I know it's a taboo topic, but that's a very good example of how you can do it. Just be careful, that's all.
My name is Crystal, and I just wanted to build off the thread you all opened earlier around history and education, and the lack of it, the distortion of it, the ways you've had to learn it for yourself, right? Especially starting within your own family history. And so my question has to do with how do we practice, how do we help each other build the skills to actually practice oral history, the listening, the understanding, tapping into your own curiosity. I lead an online community that's trying to help people across the Chinese diaspora to do that work and to sit with and be present in that discomfort. And so, whether it's Crystal, Ryan creating your own content, all of you, those conversations that you've had off camera, behind the camera, your whole lives, within your own minds with yourself, right? What has helped you tap into your curiosity, really look yourself in the mirror, right? And when you look at those who've raised you, those who've fed you, clothed you, right? And it's like, hey, I'm not trying to necessarily change you, I want to understand you. And what has helped you to reconcile having that compassion and releasing that judgment for yourself, for your people, for each other? Thank you.
That's a beautiful way to kind of wrap up, because that's what we're trying to do here, right? And it comes with just these little conversations. My curiosity came from a personal space, and otherwise I might not have opened up this whole Pandora's box, right? But you need to make that effort. Like, I had to go to school. I'm doing a freaking doctorate that I'm not done with because I needed so much research to give myself the knowledge and the capacity to look beyond and learn how to challenge structures and to learn how to challenge the existing things and look at what's missing. I think for me, looking for the missing spaces is what ticks me, because it's like, well, what are we not talking about that we need to talk about? And if we can shift our way of thinking and not consuming, like how media kind of just feeds these ugly truths, if we can look beyond that and challenge existing structures, I think that's a strong way to make things change, personally.
I mean, just in short, look, we all know, those of us who are Asian in the room, we know that it's sometimes a little difficult to communicate with our parents and the older generations, but I actually think that they want to tell their stories. If asked, they really want to share. But I think we all have gotten into the habit of just sort of like just existing rather than taking that time. And when you find those windows, when they avail themselves, really try to open that door a little wider, because it's incredible when you're able to experience your family's history and what that opens up, the sort of tangents and the deviations that those experiences and those conversations will take you on.
Ask your grandmother if she snuck out or what she did when she was a teenager. I bet you will find stories.
If I can, I mean, I was afraid to ask my grandma about the family that lives in Shanghai, because in my mind I had just created a story that, she didn't want them to know about my black ass, you know what I mean? And then I asked her, and she's like, yeah, I mean, all you had to do was ask. We can go, like, next week. If you want to go to Shanghai next week and meet my family out there, we can do that. So it's really just not being afraid to just ask the question. A question. Start with a question. I think we're just afraid of the repercussions or the consequences, but really what we're going to suffer is is a reward of knowing ourselves better if we do ask the question.
Yeah, I mean, in my family, my dad grew up in Shanghai in the 1920s, 30s, and he just recently passed away in March, and he had Alzheimer's dementia. So many years ago, I would say about 10 years ago, my sister and I started to record his oral history, because he always told his stories, little snippets of his stories of him growing up. It was fascinating. That he was the son of a gangster, then he left to go to Taiwan to study engineering because he didn't want to be part of that life. And then he got caught up in the the communist revolution and couldn't go back. And he never saw his father again. And there's so much pain and regret for leaving his father that he loved so much. But at the same time, he wanted a better life for himself. And so, like, we recorded all that. My sister wrote a book. I have it. And now, like, eventually, I want to make a film about it at some point. But I haven't been ready for it yet. But after my dad's passing, I think it's time to approach that. But do those things. Get your family's oral history, whether it's, you're going to use it now or later, whatever. Record it, put it down, write it down, film it on video, whatever, and save those stories because they can be useful later on.